am Linda van Tilburg for National Security News. The NATO summit wrapped up in The Hague with a landmark pledge. Member states have committed to boosting defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2035. It was a gathering, some say, that was carefully calibrated to appease Donald Trump and prevent a potential US exit from the alliance. But just how committed is Trump to NATO's core guarantee, Article 5, the Mutual Defense Clause? Well, joining us to unpack what this means for the alliance and for Europe's security is ex-Colonel Phil Ingram, former senior British intelligence officer and NATO planner. Hi, Phil. So nice to see you again.
So nice to see you again as well.
So what were your key takeaways from the NATO summit?
Well, a couple of things struck me about it. One, it seemed to be the Donald Trump show. Everyone was running around swanning after Donald Trump, and he was the center of attention, the center of focus. Now, was that a good thing? I suppose it had to happen to try and keep him on side. But there were some quite good statements came out from Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, throughout the whole event. We're talking about increasing defense spending with NATO contributing countries and getting that agreement on 5%, split 3.5% on defense and 1.5% on other issues. That's good because it's getting, especially the European NATO nations, to stand up to their responsibilities. But within that, he talked about using it to increase their defense industrial bases. Again, that's good. And he embarrassed, I think, many of the European countries by turning around and saying Russia, with a GDP of less than 20% of what we have, is outproducing us in artillery and tanks and everything else. So again, that put a clear reminder in there. And of course, at the end of it, Donald Trump came in. He seemed to be more cooperative with European nations. He wasn't anti them as he is when it comes to things from a trade perspective. He seemed to appreciate the agreements to increase defense spending, and he quite clearly underpinned the United States' position with regard to Article 5 of the NATO Constitution, where an attack on one is an attack on all. And I think that's what the European NATO nations, and I'll add Canada into that as well, really wanted. So I think overall, it got the results it wanted.
Well, afterwards, at a news conference, when he talked about Article 5, he said, depends on your definition. So does that ring alarm bells?
It sort of rings a little tinkle rather than full alarm bells going off. It's better than he said whenever he was president first time around, where he said, if you don't pay, I don't play. And that's what undermined the whole thing. And actually, when you drill into Article 5, it all does depend on the definition, and it all depends on the circumstance. And each individual country has got the ability to decide what level of support they could do. And it could range from sending a very nice little card saying, hey, we support you, right through to providing huge military capability. Both under the definition would be supporting someone who has been attacked from an article and supporting them from an Article 5 perspective. So it's always open to negotiation and interpretation. The positive is he didn't say, no, we're not, you're on your own, or put some other form of caveat that was obvious. And in his final statement, yes, he did say after comments, depends on your definition, but his final statement, he was quite clear, and his staffs are quite clear that the United States stands by Article 5.
So if any of the European countries are attached, do you think Trump would be there to support them?
I think he would be. Now, again, with what would depend on how people are attacked and what the US interests are within it. But it's interesting, the only time Article 5 in NATO's history has ever been called was called by the United States, and that was after the 9/11 attacks in New York on the Twin Towers. And not only all NATO countries came and rallied around the United States, but then they helped bring in a wider coalition of the willing to come and help the United States in its global war on terrorism and deploying into Afghanistan. So Donald Trump is cheeky when he turned around, I think, and says we're not going to come and support things. But I think he's been using it as a tactic to get European NATO nations to step up, because for too many years, Europe has been relying on the United States. It hasn't been paying its way. It hasn't developed its military capability. It hasn't. It's used the money that it saved to gain economic advantage over the United States. So I'm not a Trump fan in any way, shape, or form, but I can see why Trump would have a beef with that. And I support exactly what he's doing to get European nations to step up. I think he's trying to deliberately be not exact in some of the responses he's giving, because he wants to see if NATO nations, if European nations actually do properly step up and start spending money. Of course, in the back of Donald Trump's mind, it'll be spending money on defense items provided by US companies is what he ultimately wants. I think he's going to be shocked slightly, because he's also stimulated the European defense industrial base, and I include the UK's in that, to step up a little bit. And it will be in competition with the US's defense industrial base when it gets its capacity up to the levels that are needed, looking at the insecurities that are around the world.
But there seems to be some resistance from EU countries. Notably, it was Spain, Belgium, and Slovakia. Is this a new wedge inside the alliance?
I've asked that question of lots of people working in the alliance myself, and no, I don't think it is. If we looked at what they before the NATO summit, the requirement was for 2% of GDP to be spent on defence. Some countries spent more. A lot of countries spent less. We go back 10, 15 years, there were only, I think, 3 countries that spent the 2% of GDP on defence. Go back to after Donald Trump's first time as president, that went up to 23 countries, but there's 32 countries in NATO, so that means there's still a significant number that aren't spending that. What I find equally interesting is that whilst the agreement is across NATO that countries will step up and start to spend 5% of GDP on defense, the United States itself only spends 3.2%. And that 3.2% is split between US interests in the North Atlantic, i.e. NATO area, but also in the Pacific. And therefore, in reality, in the North Atlantic area, the United States is probably investing 1.5%, 1.75%. If we looked at that, that's still significantly larger than any of the other NATO countries, but that's because the United States' GDP is so significantly larger. And therefore, I think around percentages and numbers and all the rest of it, there is an awful lot of smoke and mirrors, and I think that's what we're going to see. The important thing is the political message it sends, that people are stepping up and standing up, no matter what the numbers are, no matter who does what, where, and when. But then Donald Trump rounded on Spain and said, if you're not going to spend this on defence, watch out if you want a trade deal, because I'll hit you with tariffs.
Can the UK realistically meet that 5% of GDP pledge?
The UK couldn't work out how it was going to get to 3% in the next parliament. We've just had a strategic defence review, and the assumptions that the strategic defence review were based on have effectively been ripped up and chucked away. So that means that the defence review isn't worth the paper it was written on, because the defence review was to get to 2.5% of GDP by 2027. When the day the review was announced, Keir Starmer said, we've got a plan to come up to 2.6%. He was adding stuff in that didn't count at the time, but now counts in the redefinition of certain things under NATO. And he said we'll get to 3% at some stage by the end of the next parliament, which our next general election is until 2029. So we're talking into 2030 to 2035 bracket. And he had no plan for that at that time. Now that it's up to 5%, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors and a lot of things that can now fall into the definition of what's being spent on defence. And I think we'll see that happening with different countries. The UK is a past master at smoke and mirrors. So that's what we'll see. Is it going to mean any more hard cash in for the military? I am very skeptical. I don't really think so.
And what about the language that seemed noticeably softer on Russia? We didn't outright condemn Russia. Was that a concession to Trump?
I think the language around Russia was really Mark Rutte and the other leaders trying to not put Trump in a position where to agree or not to agree would put him in conflict with what his views seem to be on Vladimir Putin. I think Mark Rutte was quite clear. NATO identified Russia as the single biggest threat to NATO nations. I think Trump went one step or a couple of steps further. Trump turned around and regaled the story of where, with the Israel-Iran 12-day war, Vladimir Putin had offered to come and step in and help with the negotiations. And Donald Trump turned around and said, no, Vladimir, I want you to focus on getting peace between you and Ukraine, so go away and do that. That caught Putin off guard. But then in one of Trump's statements through the NATO conference, he turned around and admitted that Russia probably had territorial ambitions beyond Ukraine. And that in itself was a massive statement. Combine that with Trump underpinning Article 5, I think, and I might be too early to say this, but I think I'm beginning to see a few green shoots of Trump getting a little frustrated, if not slightly stronger words could come in with Vladimir Putin, and we may see some actions being taken in the coming days or weeks.
Well, Phil Ingram, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.